What is up, ghouls and gamers? It's Rusty here with another Value Vintage Deck Tech. Today we're talking about a deck that's really near and dear to my heart. It's one of my favorites, and I think it might be the Value Vintage deck that I have the most reps with. This is a blue-white Sailor's Bane Tolarian Terror deck. But first, I want to talk about something really exciting. What's this up here? This is our new TCG player affiliate link. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a kind of sponsored little bit that TCG Player is partnering with us for. Basically, if you put that link into your browser and then purchase any cards from TCG Player, they will give us a small percentage back in cold hard cash. This is really exciting. If you guys are able to remember to use it, it's no cost to you, and it'll just help us build up some additional marketing funds. Anything that comes through that will be going back into the format in some capacity, whether it's picking up like advertising marketing stuff, like business cards or stickers. Maybe if it gets to a point where it's worth it, we can look into kind of rolling it into some tournament funds or something like that. It's really just a cool way to actually have some amount of income associated with this format. Previously, everything has been funded out of our own pockets just because we love doing this as a format. But as we're expanding, we're looking at a lot of different ways that we can make this more and more sustainable. And part of sustainability is making sure that it's not a financial drain on me and the other mod team. So even if it just ends up being a few bucks here and there, which is kind of what I think this will look like, it is going to help support the format. It doesn't really take much from you guys. We'll make some more posts about this, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to at me in the Discord and ask. But right now, you can just type this into your browser, and you can use that to buy cards, and it'll help out the format. So thanks for considering that, and thanks to TCG Player for partnering with us. But moving into the deck. This is a really cool blue-white deck that's built around Sailor's Bane, and a lot of you have maybe not seen that card. It's pretty wildly unpopular in every format. It doesn't really have a home, and it actually wasn't on Magic Online for a long time. I didn't know about this card for a while. Tolarian Terror is a card people have seen. Pauper players have been all over that for a while. I used to play... It was actually before Tolarian Terror, but I used to play like a blue-red control deck in Pauper that played Serpentine Curve, which is a 4-mana spell that makes a big guy. This card's kind of pushed that strategy or that exact threat out of the way and kind of taken its place. So I played some Tolarian Terror. But Sailor's Bane has some really big upsides to Tolarian Terror. I actually learned about this card just about 2 years ago now. I was at one of our local game stores playing one of our events, and my friend Doug came up to me and he said, Russell, I have a card to tell you about with a caveat that you are never allowed to cast it against me. I think I've done a pretty good job of obeying that order. I have not played too much Bane against Doug, but I probably have cast it a few times. The first thing to point out here, and really the biggest thing, is that this card counts the cards in your exile in addition to your graveyard, right? So Tolarian Terror, if your opponent messes with your graveyard through a Rest in Peace or a Tormod's Crypt, or if you delve away your graveyard to something like a Dig Through Time, your Tolarian Terror can go back to costing 7 mana. With Sailor's Bane, once you get an instant or sorcery in the graveyard, there's really not a reasonable way for it to stop discounting the Sailor's Bane. It's either going to be in the graveyard or it's going to go into exile. So that's the biggest difference. By playing Sailor's Banes, you're more insulated to graveyard effects. A lot of people don't even bother with one-shot graveyard effects against this deck. And then obviously Sailor's Bane is larger and has a higher ward value. The downside is that Sailor's Bane never costs 1 mana. It'll only be discounted to blue-blue, whereas Terror can be discounted to blue. For the longest time, I was on a 3-3 split. My thought being that sometimes a Tolarian Terror can come out a little bit faster or a little bit cheaper and block some stuff, and you had enough inevitability without it. I'm on the 4-2 split right now. Sailor's Bane's a little bit cheaper. That's not the reason I do it. I'm a little scared of Leyline of the Void. That card has gone back up a decent amount, but I'm still a little concerned about playing against it because it turns so many of my card advantage spells off that I think the concession to that card of playing 4 Banes is nice. Additionally, you'll probably notice this is a very, very threat light deck. We don't have any man lands. We have 7 creatures, and if we can't win the game with our 7 creatures, or I guess Archmage's Charm stealing 1-drops, we can't win the game. I will go on record right now and say I have never run out of threats in a game with this deck, and I have never milled myself out and been unable to win the game. Well, that's kind of not true. There's some games where you go to the end of the deck if it's a major grinder, but 7 threats is low, but I find that these are hard enough to answer, and they come down in large enough numbers in the late game. Like, it's not uncommon to build up to a turn where you cast 2 Sailor's Bane for 4 mana total, and then hold up Counterspell. Additionally, Monastery Mentor kind of acts as like a late game get out of jail free card. You can spend all 6 of your primary threats to tie up your opponent's resources, and then you can generate an advantage state and then play a Monastery Mentor with like double Counterspell, Spell Pierce, Cantrip up. And when you do that, it's really hard to not at least generate enough monks to close it out. It is fair to be concerned about having enough threats to close out the game, but I have not had it be an issue, so I'm really happy with this number. I'll talk more about deploying threats and what we do with them in a bit, but let's just talk about the core of the deck. Not very many creatures, an okay number of lands, and a bunch of instants and sorceries. Obviously that makes sense because we're built around them, either to discount our creatures or to trigger our mentor. We're also very graveyard focused, so playing cards like Thought Scour is very premium in this deck. Faithful Mending is a card I've been quite impressed by. This deck is kind of a, let's call it a turbo Xerox deck, sort of, which was an old term for legacy decks that played low land counts and a high degree of cantrips. The theory there was that every card is more or less the same, and you have so much selection. You can kind of skimp on lands, play a lot of selection, and make sure you're kind of drawing the right cards. This uses the same idea, but unfortunately, you still do kind of draw too many lands sometimes as you move into the late game. Having 2 extra lands that you don't need, that you cantripped into off of like Considers where you Surveil or something, can be backbreaking. 2 Faithful Mendings felt like the right amount to bend them, and you also sometimes get some value by Thought Scouring these over. Frantic Inventory, I think, is actually one of the most important cards in this deck. A lot of people who play against me a lot on this deck really don't like the Frantic Inventories, because you kind of feel like you're playing at parity with the Blue-White Bane player until they resolve a Frantic Inventory drawing 2, and then when they resolve a Frantic Inventory to draw 3, the game was actually really close to over. Because this deck has a lot of air in the Considers, Thought Scours, etc., but then it also has a lot of cards that are going to efficiently draw between 2 and 4 cards. Sometimes I joke about calling this deck blue-white restricted cards because we are playing Balance, Monastery Mentor, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time. And they're all really important. There was a time where I would sometimes sideboard out Cruise or Dig if I felt like I had to just have my cards be effective and castable, like it was a really aggressive matchup. I've come around to the point where I never sideboard out Treasure Cruise or Dig because so much of the deck is air that just replaces itself and churns. You get to a point in the game where you're kind of treading water or hanging on with like Counterspells and Swords to Plowshares, and you're just digging to find your Frantic Inventory that draws 3 cards, or your copy of Treasure Cruise or Dig Through Time. And it feels like as soon as you find one of those cards, let's call it 4 hits, because we theoretically have 2 Frantic Inventories in the bin. Once you find one of those cards, you get to really turn the corner and start winning the game. Because all of our cards that impact the board are going to do so in a way that is generally going to net us mana. Balance is kind of its own thing, so we won't talk about that, but 5 spot removal spells in Swords and Path, Spell Pierce, Lose Focus, Counterspell, and Archmage's Charm. All of these cards tend to trade up on mana. The really hard matchups are the ones where we're not going to be able to trade a Lose Focus or a Counterspell for tempo. Those are matchups where most of their cards cost 1, like Burn. or something just that low to the ground, where it's actually a liability to be trying to trade a 2-mana spell for a 1-mana spell. Additionally, our primary threats generally cost between 1 and 2 mana. I have cast a 4-mana Tolarian Terror and gone on to win the game. It doesn't feel good. I have cast like a 5-mana Sailor's Bane. Sometimes that's correct, but in general, you don't want to deploy a single threat until you can do so while holding up interaction. A lot of people look at a list like this, and they think it's a tempo deck the way that Delver is a tempo deck. They think that your goal is to get a threat down and ride it to victory. I don't think that's the case. I think this is somewhere between a control deck or like a Death Shadow style strategy, in that you want to spend your early turns either interacting or cantripping until you get to a point where you can deploy a Sailor's Bane for 2 mana while also holding up a Counterspell or a couple of Swords to Plowshares. That's kind of how I look at it, and I think that you should generally never tap out fully in this deck. The exceptions are when you're in really dire circumstances. Turn 1, it's okay to preordain because you don't usually need to represent Spell Pierce or Swords to Plowshares, so I don't mind going like Island, preordain, go. But on turn 2, if I have a preordain in my hand, I'll almost never cast it because I need to at least bluff a counterspell, even if I don't have one. Ideally, you do actually have a piece of turn 2 counter magic, or like a Spell Pierce, or at least some cantrips, but it's really, really bad to tap out in this deck. And I think that's also one of the advantages this deck brings. I think it's one of the best decks at not tapping out in the early game, and not ever necessarily needing to tap out to give your opponent a chance to resolve something. On that note, I mentioned earlier that some people think you want to deploy one threat and kind of like protect it and ride it to victory. I actually don't agree. The first Tolarian Terror or Sailor's Bane that I cast, I'm almost never going to protect. The one case is if I have a Spell Pierce that I'm worried about rotting, because the ward cost on your threats means that even if your opponent's interaction is like Swords to Plowshares, if you have a Sailor's Bane, it costs 5 mana to resolve a Swords to Plowshares against it, which means my 2 copies of Spell Pierce are going to be live even on turn 6, which is crazy. I think that's a huge advantage of playing a threat suite that only has ward. It lets you main deck Spell Pierces and feel good about them into the late game. Some people might look at this list and want to add something like Duelist of the Mind, or Thing in the Ice, or even Delver of Secrets. I think doing that is a mistake because that's giving your opponent a place where they can use a removal spell efficiently to generate a mana advantage against you. Like if you spend 2 mana on a Thing in the Ice and your opponent spends 1 mana on a Swords to Plowshares, you've actually spent 1 more mana than your opponent. So you're kind of getting behind in tempo. Monastery Mentor is the exception to that because you generally aren't casting your Monastery Mentor until you can protect it, or until you can get value off of it, even if it is removed by casting some cantrips in response, or sometimes you just cast it on turn 3 if things are looking a little rough and you need to get lucky to win. So going back to the idea of trading these off really fast, if I have a Tolarian Terror in play and I've got some other stuff to do with my mana, like I have a Counterspell up, and my opponent spends their turn 4 to cast a Doomblade equivalent on the Terror, or even a 3-mana Swords to Plowshares, I'm just going to let it go. Because I'm not trying to win the game with the first threat. I'm trying to spend 1 mana on a threat that is either going to kill you or force you to spend 3 mana. And then I am able to start taking the lead by using my cantrips to find my powerful advantage spells like Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, or Frantic Inventory number 3. Or, even another Sailor's Bane. Sailor's Bane is a really high-quality card once you have 7 instants and sorceries somewhere. A 2-mana 7/7 Ward 4 is one of the best cards in the format. The really obvious card to compare it to is Murktide Regent. I am not going to say anything crazy like this card is better than Murktide Regent. This card is very similar and has some distinct upsides. The main upside that I see, well, there's two. One is that you never go down on mana compared to a Murktide. If you are playing Modern and you play a 2-mana Murktide Regent, it is possible for your opponent to answer it with an Unholy Heat or a Leyline Binding. Sailor's Bane, when you pay it for 2 mana, there are some corner cases, like Sudden Edict, for example, but generally your opponent is never going to get a mana advantage on you because you cast a Sailor's Bane. Additionally, you can deploy 2 Sailor's Banes a lot easier than you can deploy 2 Murktides, and you can deploy Sailor's Banes after a Dig Through Time or a Graveyard exiling spell. Those are the upsides against Murktide Regent, which is the most comparable card. Obvious downsides are that it doesn't fly. A lack of evasion can be a challenge for this deck. I played this in a 4-round Mavericks Weekly a couple weeks back. I went 3-0-1. I got a draw against a Sultai Shardless Agent deck playing Grist and Mosswood Dread Knight, and they were just able to 2-for-1 and put so many little chump blocking bodies in front of me that it was really hard to close out the game. So we had really long grindy games, and even when I had a Sailor's Bane or 2 in play, if they have a Grist in play, it just upticks and answers a Sailor's Bane. So there are downsides. I'm not saying this card's better than Murktide Regent. I'm saying it's comparable, and there are upsides that we should try our best to leverage. Couple cards I haven't really talked about. Archmage's Charm is strong. Like I mentioned, there are some dangers of kind of flooding out when your cantrips just find too many lands. Archmage's Charm being a modal counterspell or draw spell is really important. 2 has felt like the right amount. I have played more in the past, but 2 feels good right now. I used to play a 1 of Mystic Confluence before Archmage's Charm got countered as one serious piece of fat. It was often very, very good, even game-winning, because, again, so the comparison for Mystic Confluence is Cryptic Command. They're both 4 or 5 mana instants. They both get a 2 or 3-for-1. Obviously, 5 mana on Mystic Confluence is more than Cryptic Command, but when you're resolving one, I actually think that Mystic Confluence is pound for pound the more powerful card, and paying the additional 1 mana feels really reasonable. It's not uncommon to use it as 5 mana draw 3, which is okay. It's not uncommon to use it as 5 mana bounce 3, which is pretty good tempo. And whenever you do a mixture of them, counter one thing, draw a card, bounce something, it feels really good. So you could bring back in 1 Mystic Confluence, but for me, Archmage's Charm has kind of been that modal, grindy, affect the board sort of card. It's been really good. One thing I have been doing, this has kind of been a level up moment for me with the deck. I've been finding myself having mana to cast an Archmage's Charm on my opponent's turn and then choosing not to for the draw 2 mode. One thing I've found is that there are some game states where I'm vaguely ahead with 1 Tolarian Terror in play against kind of an empty board and a low hand, and I could use my Archmage's Charm as a divination, but if I don't find a counterspell or cantrips that find a counterspell, I could end up in a really sticky situation if I don't have a counterspell for my opponent's next powerful card. So sometimes I'll just choose not to spend my mana and save this because I'm deciding that a hard counterspell in hand is better than 2 random cards that could theoretically be bricks. That's felt like a little bit of a level up moment for me. I might be outthinking myself a little bit, but there have been times where it's felt very correct. The last card to talk about is Balance. This is a very unique card. If you are not a longtime Value Vintage player or a player of a small number of other formats, you may not have cast very many Balances. I feel like I'm still learning what decks to play this in and how to play it, but it's a very powerful card. The biggest thing is that it's a 2-mana board wipe when you have no creatures on the board. That alone is pretty good. You'll notice I'm a white, arguably control deck that doesn't have any 4-mana sweepers in my deck, and it's because my mana base can't support them. We'll talk about the mana base last, but there are 6 white sources in the deck. It's really a mono blue deck with a white splash. I would kind of like to go up on Glacial Fortresses. It looks like I've got the budget for it right now. So there's a chance it should just be 4 Fortress, 4 Port Town. But I can't afford to put white cards in my mana base right now, so Balance is the only sweeper we have. When we're playing against creature-focused matchups, we do have some additional paths in the sideboard, but we don't get to sideboard in wraths. So balance does something really unique. We are often going to discard more cards than our opponent. They're usually going to have less cards in hand when we cast this, and we are going to not necessarily get a strict card advantage. But what we are going to do is generate a lot of tempo. We are theoretically going to fill our graveyard. It's something that's happened before is I've balanced away 3 creatures and gone to like 2 or 3 cards in hand, but one of them has been a treasure cruise, so the 3 cards that I discarded let me cruise on the next turn, and then that lets me get ahead of a post-balance opponent. Additionally, just as far as the card-for-card equation goes, when your cards are Treasure Cruise or Dig Through Time, Swords to Plowshares or Counterspell, and Sailor's Bane or Tolarian Terror, our best cards are better than a lot of cards. So when we get balanced, we can hope that our cards are going to be pound for pound better than our opponents, especially if they're going to get us more of our cards that are pound for pound pretty good. As far as deploying a Sailor's Bane and then being forced to balance, again, you kind of hope that Sailor's Bane is bigger than your opponent's best creature. That's not always the case, but one thing that really tips the scale on balance for me is that it is better the worse the game is going, right? If you mull to 4 and get him to Turok, balance is really, really good if you can cast it. If you have 0 creatures in play and your opponent has 30 creatures in play, balance is very, very good. With that in mind, it lives in the main board. I do find it not worth casting or just getting Faithful Mending away a decent amount. But the counterpoint is that when it's really good, it can just win the game. It does something really unique and is relatively cheap. I'm really comfortable with it in the main board. I wouldn't necessarily fault you for putting it in the sideboard, but I wouldn't encourage you to. I would suggest just playing some games with balance before you make a decision on that. Now let's talk sideboard. Specifically, my sideboard and kind of my main board looks a little all over the place with the numbers. 3 loose focus, 2 counter spells. That's mostly a budget thing. 2 spell pierce, 5 spot removal. The only thing I can really say is that I've played this deck for quite a while. I've had this deck together for probably a year and a half or so, and I used to play a blue-red version before that, so I have a lot of experience with it. And these numbers have just felt like pretty right from feeling it out and playing through it. So a lot of what's in the sideboard reflects that and is kind of just giving me the options to shift to a more removal or counterspell heavy playstyle, depending on what the matchup looks like. It's a lot of stuff like your sideboarding is sometimes like sideboard out 2 spell pierce and bring in a loose focus and something else, right? It's not about having like the best haymakers in all 15 of our slots. It's about just making our configuration fit what the opponent's doing a little bit better. With that in mind, we have 2 additional pieces of spot removal for creature-heavy decks. This could be initiative, elves, goblins, a Lurrus-based thing. Anywhere where we need to answer creatures, we can go up to a total of 7 spot removal spells, which is a pretty good number. Additionally, for creature decks, this is one of the most interesting sideboard cards, and probably the one I'll talk about the most, is Hushbringer. Hushbringer generally, or the reason that I've included Hushbringer in the deck was as specifically an answer to White Plume Adventure-based initiative decks. This card doesn't make the initiative matchup easy, but it does make it possible. You can sometimes get it in under the first White Plume, and if they don't have removal for it, they can't start the initiative or the Monarch. Additionally, if they do get a White Plume down, like let's say they're on the play in Game 3, and they go Avacyn's Pilgrim into White Plume Adventurer, your Hushbringer is going to be too slow, but you can play it, take your lumps from the White Plume, and then hope to take the initiative back with the Hushbringer, and then use a combination of interaction like Swords to Plowshares and counterspells to hold on to the initiative. And once you have a Hushbringer in play, it means that your opponent can no longer just top deck a Palace Jailer or a White Plume, sneak it through a counterspell, and then be in charge of the game state again. It means that your removal spells actually work on the entire creature, instead of being in this situation where any creature that resolves beats you because it takes the initiative back. Hushbringer also has really random applications against a lot of creature-based decks. 5-color humans is really popular, and this is very good against 5-color humans. I think they usually play like 2 copies of Swords to Plowshares, and the rest of their deck is fairly enters the battlefield dependent. It's good against goblins as a really notable one. It turns off death triggers as well, so they can't kill it with Munitions Expert, and they can't trigger Runebelt Hordemaster or Pashlik Mons to kill it. There are a lot of matchups that you wouldn't expect this to be good in, where you bring it in and your opponent just looks like their soul left their body because they realize they sideboarded out their removal or they don't have removal that works, and they can't clear it, and most of their cards don't do anything. You could also consider playing Doorkeeper Thrall. It's the same thing, except it's got Flash instead of Lifelink, and it catches Artifact ETBs instead of Death Triggers as well. It's actually currently cheaper. Doorkeeper Thrall was not cheaper for a while, and now it is. I just ordered my playset, and I'm planning to kind of move them in and out interchangeably. The idea of my opponent putting a White Plume Adventurer on the stack and then flashing in a Doorkeeper Thrall is really, really appealing, whereas if you had a Hushbringer, you might have to play it at sorcery speed, and then your opponent can choose to save their White Plume, maybe develop a threat that's less reliant on its ETB until they can find an answer for the Hushbringer. Whereas the Doorkeeper Thrall really gets them, and it just fits into kind of the flash-based instant speed play patterns of the deck. Soul Guide Lanterns. These have not seemed like they're the most important. These are specifically for like grindier graveyard-based decks like Lurrus or Martyr Proc. I'm not sure I really need these right now. It's important that they can draw a card, but I could see myself moving away from these. I don't know towards what, but they haven't felt like the most critical. Ravenous Trap, on the other hand, is really for the more combo-based all-in graveyard decks like Cephalid Breakfast or Dredge type things. This has been a little suppressed by Leyline of the Void lately, and I also think that those matchups, Spell Pierce and just any counterspells, are going to be generally pretty good. So I think we can skimp on our combo graveyard hate a little bit, but 2 Ravenous Traps has felt fine. Lose Focus and Test of Talents are just additional counterspells. If you're new to the format, Lose Focus doesn't look very impressive. If you've been around the format for a while, you probably love this card. I was skeptical at first. I thought it was worse than Mana Leak. But it does a couple interesting things. Normally, it gets people for 2 mana when you need it to, and it stays relevant into the late game in a way that Mana Leak doesn't. It's very possible to counter something when your opponent has 8 lands and you also have 8 lands. Additionally, when you're playing the Control Mirror, this essentially cannot be countered because there are 3 copies targeting your opponent's spell. So if they have a Spell Pierce or a Mystical Dispute, it doesn't really matter. This also catches a Cascader and the Cascade. I mentioned I played against Shardless Bug the other week. Lose Focus was a huge part of the reason I was able to win the one game that I did, because I was able to cleanly answer a Shardless Agent, whereas if I just had Counterspell, them developing the 2/2 body would be relevant. Test of Talents is kind of just me respecting High Tide a little bit more. I theorize that this deck has a good High Tide matchup, but High Tide is slippery. High Tide is very, very slippery. I could see games where I don't present a fast enough clock and they're able to do the High Tide thing despite my best efforts, and Test is just a nod to helping that a little bit more. Then Energy Flux. I've been as high as 4 of these in the past. This deck has a very hard time with traditional Thoughtcast based affinity. It's very hard to control that deck because of a combination of their speed and the number of spells that if they get through, they just win the game. So that's primarily what this is targeting. It does have some additional uses, like I've brought it in against Thopter Sword and won the game based on it. I brought it in the other day against Joe, who was playing his Naya Boom Bust Initiative mid-range deck. He's currently playing a version that plays a lot of the indestructible tap lands. It plays 4 unstable amulets. It plays Darksteel Citadel, so he can Cleansing Wildfire himself. And I actually brought this in, and I cast it on turn 3 when he had an artifact land in play, and he had to sacrifice his artifact land so he couldn't cast a 4-mana Chandra, and then it just kind of kept him off a lot of mana. So the card has random applications. you know, that's really all I got. We're at about 30 minutes right now, and I think I've said most of what I have to say. I think this deck's very, very powerful. Like I said, I went 3-0-1 in a 4-round event the other week. We went to a 30-person event up in Athens. It was 5-round Swiss. I went 4-1 with this deck. I lost to a very aggressive mono-red deck playing like Monastery Swift Spear, Pump Spells, and Thud. I just got rolled. And previously, at one of our Mavericks 1Ks, I went undefeated in the Swiss playing this deck. This deck is very strong. If you pick it up and it feels clunky or unintuitive or not powerful when you first play it, I encourage you to just keep playing it, maybe ask questions to myself or someone else. I think some of the play patterns are a little unintuitive, and I think you have to get to know the deck to unlock its strength. But I think that it has game against nearly everything in the format, and a lot of matchups feel very favorable. Sailor's Bane recently got added to Magic Online, which I'm very excited for. I think I'll do some League content with this soon. But I encourage you to check out this deck, give it a try, let me know your thoughts, and yell at me for only having 6 white sources in the deck. Again, just as a reminder, if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please go ahead and do that. We're trying to make a video a week all year. We'll see if we hit that high bar, but we are going to have more content coming regardless. And additionally, just as a reminder, write down, save somewhere this TCG player link. We'll be announcing it in the Discord soon as well. And just, buy your cards through that, help out the format a little bit. That'll help us afford more business cards, more stickers, all that stuff that keeps the format growing and running smoothly. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and come back for the next one.